Thank you.
What you're seeing is real. April 10th through April 20th in Swansboro, North Carolina. This has been repeated across the country in the last 2 years. So-called urban warfare training in America. Of course, in the case of Swansboro, they actually pulled people over and searched their vehicles with the local police department. A local listener sent me this video of the Swansboro incident. You see, they take out groups of young officers from across the country in the Marine Corps and teach them that it's okay to go into American towns and cities and take over the city halls and search vehicles. In this training exercise, it became real. They become so arrogant, they just followed their orders and began to search people's vehicles. And as you're about to find out, it's not just the Marines, it's the Army too, in Central Texas. Well, here's some Marines training to search people's vehicles, and guess what? This is some poor Swansboro resident that had to come through the checkpoint to get home.
Searching the vehicle right now.
Copy your last. Stop the vehicle. Have 2 males detained. Keep us abreast of what is going on with the situation. Copy.
Roger, I copy.
Well, I'm glad the Marines are learning how to do their police work, and, well, here's 2 of the troublemakers now that they've apprehended. But before you can set up your checkpoints, you've got to first move out and create a perimeter. This is all extremely healthy for the locals to see. It's, to train them that it's all, again, completely normal. To have troops running around your neighborhood at night pulling vehicles over. It's all part of living in America. I wonder what the government's so worried about in the future that we need to have all this training.
It says people who oppose abortion or worry about the threat of illegal aliens could pose a radical threat to America. They're the ones we need to be watching at Homeland Security. Why are conservative values suddenly being singled out as a terror threat?
Are we at a greater risk of domestic terrorism events like that today or lesser?
I think we're at a greater state of readiness. The threat of terrorism, whether from a foreign source or domestic source, is now just, it's with us. We have to acknowledge that. We have to minimize the risk of it, and we have to be ready to deal with it. And I think with the Department of Homeland Security, all the changes that have occurred since Oklahoma City, since 9/11, there has been improvement.
As you know, a recent report from your department raised a lot of eyebrows and caused a bit of controversy, because in that report you said this, that the Department of Homeland Security assesses that right-wing extremists will attempt to recruit and radicalize returning veterans in order to exploit their skills and knowledge derived from military training and combat. The willingness of a small percentage of military personnel to join the extremist groups during the 1990s because they were disgruntled, disillusioned, or suffering from the psychological effects of war is being replicated today. Is being replicated today. You have active intelligence that tells you people coming back from Iraq, coming back from Afghanistan, who might be mad at the military, who might simply have post-traumatic stress disorder, are being actively recruited by extremist groups?
Certainly, and our department is not the only department that has made that comment. The FBI has made the same comment. Other groups have made the same comment. Here's the important point. The report is not saying that veterans are extremists, far from it. What it is saying is returning veterans are targets of right-wing extremist groups that are trying to recruit those to commit violent acts within the country. We want to do all we can to prevent that.
But when you say will attempt, Who are these groups? What do they want to do?
Well, it's a number of groups, almost far too numerous to mention, and regrettably so. But some of them, indeed, want to do what happened in Oklahoma City. That is, commit violent acts within the homeland. And again, from the Homeland Security, we were stood up because of a terrorist act, 9/11. But that came on the heels of Oklahoma City, which was a domestically caused terrorist act. So one of our missions that Congress has given us and that we do is try to keep everybody informed. What are the kinds of things that can lead to an act of violence, but in this case, where are groups recruiting?
That includes New Orleans, where today authorities stepped up their efforts to empty the city. Bob Woodruff is there again tonight with an extraordinary human drama unfolding. Bob?
That's true, Elizabeth, and good evening from New Orleans. Here, the police and the National Guard find themselves in a very difficult position tonight to try to carry out an order to force people from the city without actually using force.
Today in New Orleans, they got a lot tougher on the holdouts.
Police department, go home!
Not only the flooded areas, but New Orleans' driest and wealthiest neighborhoods, too.
Police department!
The police and National Guard going street by street, house to house.
We need to make sure, too, that whenever we knock on doors, people refuse to leave, we need to make note, call it in.
They say there are no orders to use force, just strong persuasion, sometimes entering open houses with guns drawn, and instructions to disarm anyone inside.
You said guns will be taken? No one will be able to be armed. We will take all weapons.
That happened today in this wealthy neighborhood where homeowners had armed themselves to protect their mansions. Residents were handcuffed on the ground. In the end, police took their weapons but let them stay in their homes.
They were a little bit threatened because our weapons were bigger than their weapons.
For many of the police and guard troops, it is an uncomfortable job to do this in an American city. This guard unit occupied a church, using it as a base camp. They had to leave a note because they could not get hold of the pastor to get permission.
It is surreal. Yeah, you never expect to do this in your own country.
Chris Montgomery says he'd rather be in Iraq than patrolling American neighborhoods.
Walking up and down these streets, you don't want to think about the stuff that you're going to have to do. Somebody pops around the corner.
Let me shoot in America.
In an early notice development last week, the Army stationed an active unit inside the United States. The Infantry Division's 1st Brigade team is back from Iraq, now training for domestic operations under the control of U.S. Army North, the Army service component of Northern Command. The unit will serve as an on-call federal response for large-scale emergencies and disasters. It's being called the Consequence Management Response Force, CCMRF, or CSMRF for short. It's the first time an active unit has been given a dedicated assignment to U.S. Northcom, which was itself formed in October 2002 to, quote, provide command and control of Department of Defense homeland defense efforts. An initial news report in the Army Times newspaper last month noted, in addition to emergency response, the force, quote, may be called upon to help with civil unrest and crowd control. The Army Times has since appended a clarification. In a September 30th press release from the Northern Command states, quote, this response force will not be called upon to help with law enforcement, civil disturbance, or crowd control. When Democracy Now! Spoke to Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Jamie Goodpaster, a public affairs officer for Northcom, she said the force would have weapons stored in containers on site as well as access to tanks, but the decision to use weapons would be made at a far higher level, perhaps by Secretary of Defense, SecDef.
If America thought aggressive action on the Occupy movement was severe, the U.S. military thinks things could get much worse amid national economic malaise, and it's preparing in case protests this year get more severe. According to Government Security News, an online publication that reports on issues of U.S. Homeland Security, the Department of Homeland Security is trying to secure extra riot gear for the U.S. military. Some of the items include 147 riot helmets, 147 sets of upper body and shoulder protection, 152 sets of thigh and groin protection, shin guards, forearm protectors, and more.
We're only talking about a $6,000 contract for riot gear. I mean, when you compare that to the military spending overall, it's an extremely small amount.
Shame! 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 Shame!
We've seen the force that police have used against mass crowds most recently in the Occupy movement, but experts say that a military intervention could be much more forceful. Military training prepares soldiers for war, and in a domestic riot, the American citizen becomes the combatant.
Policy bankruptcy of the elite. Because the way you get out of this is not by fighting cops. The way you get out of it is by ending the depression, providing an economic recovery.
In a contentious election year, federal forces seem to be preparing for an unprecedented reaction from a charged electorate. Fears that the U.S. military could be used as crowd control have grown over recent years, according to pundits. Experts say that the U.S. Army could increase its capacity to disperse riots, confiscate guns, or use deadly force against Americans in a situation of massive civil unrest. Experts say that plans to use troops for mass domestic civil unrest have been in the works for years. And with the weakened economic condition of the country, elevated unemployment, and the financial burden on Americans, there are greater fears that general discontent could manifest into a civil explosion.
I think, if anything, there might be concerns around the conventions and around the election, perhaps a repeat, shall we say, of 1968. When, a divided country produced a very contentious set of conventions.
Meanwhile, in Anaheim, California, police have clashed with protesters over law enforcement policies in recent days. 2 people have been killed by officers. The concern is that in the future, Americans could die at the hands of soldiers. Colin Campbell, Press TV, Washington.